There's three main names that you need to know when it comes to intelligence testing. It's Alfred Binet, Lewis Terman, and William Stern, and they've all done a little bit about intelligence. And I'll tell you the basic gist here. What you need to know about Binet is, I'll tell you a little bit of background. He comes from this idea of compulsory education. So in France, previously, before the early 1900s, you didn't get to go to school unless you were rich. But then all of a sudden, compulsory or forced education becomes a thing, which is what we see now in schools, right? Everyone is supposed to go to school until a certain age. If you don't, you get in trouble. So all of a sudden, we see that all these kids are going to school and they're having a hard time learning, or there's problems with their reading and writing. And so he wants to look at why these differences exist in children. Why don't we all just score well on these tests? And what he found out is that kids who came from impoverished or poor environments, the new kids coming to school, right, often scored lower. And it had to do with the nurture, the home environment, because maybe they didn't have proper nutrition. Maybe they didn't have proper arrangements for sleeping at night, or maybe they had to work, and so they didn't have a lot of time to devote to actually attending school. And so he really strongly believed, and this is what you need to know, in the nurture of education, so that intelligence is strongly infected by your environment, by your upbringing. So we're getting into this nature-nurture debate again, which comes up over and over in psychology. So he is much more nurture-based when it comes to this. Lewis Terman helps develop what's called the Stanford-Binet test, which is one of the traditional IQ tests that exists. And he is kind of the opposite of Binet. So instead of nurture, he believes more strongly in nature, that intelligence is what you're born with. And so he does most of his research around the idea of genetics and the skills that you're born with. And we still use a version of the Stanford Binet today. If you've ever taken a real IQ test, it's really a lot of questions. It takes hours and hours and hours. But you've probably taken the Stanford Binet then. And then the last person that we talk about is called William Stern, and he develops this concept of the actual IQ that we throw around today. And there's a calculation there that your IQ is your mental age, which is how old you're deemed to be based on your intelligence, divided by your chronological age times 100. I don't think you actually need to know how to calculate that. Today we take the IQ and it's scored differently. The IQ is your average performance compared to others of the same age. And so the average score on an IQ test is always 100. And then you fall either above 100, which means you'd be above average, or below 100, which means you'd be slightly below average intelligence. And we'll look at the normal curve in a second. Besides IQ tests, there's other ways that we can test intelligence, and some of these are more school related. So typically what you take in school, like your AP Psych test, would be an achievement test. An achievement test reflects what you have already learned. So the AP test is an achievement test. Your driver's exam is an achievement test. It says, do you know how to do, or do you understand this thing that we're asking you about? If you do, you pass. If you don't, you fail. An aptitude test, on the other hand, is designed to predict your future performance. And so the ACT, those are aptitude tests. Colleges look at your score and they say, okay, this predicts whether or not a student will be successful at our institution. And that's why different universities have different cutoff ranges for ACT and SAT scores. Intelligence tests are also aptitude tests. They predict your future abilities to learn, problem solve, things like that. And then the most fancy test that you need to know is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, which is today's most widely used IQ test. But what we do know, and what's important, is that these tests are strongly correlated to IQ scores. So if you took the SAT, we could generally kind of predict where your IQ would fall, because there is a strong correlation of actually about 0.9. And so if we looked at all of those different scores across the different areas, we could give you a general prediction of where your IQ would fall. How do we determine if a test is going to be useful? How does the ACT become the test that you have to take to go to college, or the SAT? So we look for 3 criteria when we talk about intelligence testing. Tests need to be standardized, reliable, and valid. And we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about each one of those things, especially reliability versus validity, because I know my students confuse that concept quite a bit. So a standardized test, you've all taken it. I think you know what it means, but do you really know like what that means in regards to like psychology and what we're talking about? So if a test is standardized, it has to have three things. It has to have uniform testing procedures, which means if I take it in Canada, or if I take it in Florida, or if I take it in Oregon, we're going to all take it in the same environment. So the AP test is an example of a standardized test because when they read you the instructions, they're reading the exact same instructions. You're taking it in the same amount of time. You're taking it probably in a similar environment. And so everything has to be really super specific because we don't want anything to be left to chance. We want everyone to have the same experience. The scores also have to be meaningful as compared to like a pre-tested group. So usually what ends up happening is college students, intro to psych, college students take the AP test at some point. And so they're like your meaningful group that you sometimes get compared to because we want to make sure that we're actually testing the average knowledge of what someone who would be taking like an intro to psych class would know. And then lastly, a test has to have a normal or normal-ish curve, which we'll look at on the next slide. So basically, what we do with the data is we take everyone who takes the AP test, which is like several 100,000 of you will take it this year, and we put them on a graph. And if we do have enough data, we hope to see that normal curve, which we'll look at on the next slide. And one thing that we found over time is that standardized tests or like intelligence tests, performance has been improving over time since about the 1930s. So think about what causes that to happen. And so if we look at what was happening in the 1930s, there was the Great Depression. It was between the world wars. There's a lot of chaos and things happening in the world. And then we come out of World War II and we have much better nutrition. We have the rise of like suburbs and the middle class. And so basically what's happening is we're taking better care of ourselves as humans. And so our brains are developing better. Families are also having less kids, so they have more time to devote to resources and time to their children. And so basically we're getting smarter as we like evolve as a society because of how we devote our time and resources. And so the Flynn effect says, yes, intelligence scores have improved over time, but we always keep IQ scores on a normal curve like this. So every few years we adjust what the 100 actually means. The 100 is just an arbitrary number, and we readjust it to be the average score. So on a normal curve, and I think we've gone over this in the statistics unit, but you need to be familiar with the normal curve. They often ask questions about it. On a normal curve, the average is in the middle. So the average on an IQ test is 100, which is in the middle there of the normal curve. And then within one standard deviation, so if you look at the bottom there, 85 is a standard deviation down, and 115 is a standard deviation up. About 68% of people fall within that 85 to 115, which kind of makes sense. If you think about IQs and you think about people, the average person, yeah, some people might fall a little bit below that. Some people might fall a little bit above that, but most people fall right around average intelligence. That's the point of the normal curve. If we step outside another standard deviation, then we're going upwards to 130 and downwards to 70. That should cover about 95% of people. And again, if you think about intelligence and just in general in society, most people fall within that range. Once we get below 70 in intelligence scores, we're talking about people who may be developmentally disabled. They may have cognitive issues. People below 70 on an IQ test may not be able to like live on their own. Some may, some might not, but we're talking into more like extreme cases. And so less than 2% of society falls within that category. And if you think about that, that does kind of make sense when you think about society as a whole. If we get above 130, then we're getting into like the extremes of intelligence, people who score quite a bit higher, who have, could be ranked as like a genius or things like that, or even higher. So Familiarize yourself with the normal curve, not just necessarily for intelligence testing, but make sure that you know I've seen that asked a lot, 68% fall within 1 standard deviation of the mean, 95% fall within 2 standard deviations. Another factor then for us to have a test that we would be like accepted for actually testing intelligence has to be reliable. And so what we mean when we say reliable is that it has consistent scores. So you don't take the ACT one day and score a 32 and the next day score a 24. That's a huge swing in points, and we would say that that's not very reliable. Does that happen? Maybe in like extreme circumstances, you were really sick or something happened to cause you to have a huge swing in points. But typically speaking, even after tutoring, you score within a few points of where you originally scored. Ways that we can test whether or not an exam is reliable is you could take the test once and then take another version again. And if your scores are consistent, we would say that it's reliable. Or one time you could take all the even numbers, one time you could take all the odd numbers. And again, if your score is fairly consistent, we would say that that test is reliable. The higher the correlation then that exists there, the higher the reliability. And that's what we want. The tests that we've talked about, like the ACT and the SAT, have about a 0.9 reliability, which is very good. So we know that those are consistent. And then the last thing is that a test has to be valid. And this is where it gets tricky. Reliability versus validity is sometimes confusing. So first and foremost, reliability does not equal validity. So kind of burn that into your brain. Validity means a test measures or predicts what it's supposed to do. So when you take a driver's test, is it measuring your driving ability? If so, then it's a valid test. It's valid at what it's saying it measures. If it doesn't test your driving ability, then it's not valid. And so there's two types of validity. There's content validity, which deals more with behavior. So the best example of that is always the driver's test. It could be like a CPR test too. That's like a skill that you might be tested on. And if that test is actually testing your ability to do those things, then it's valid. But if a driver's test is testing your ability to read out of a booklet, then it's not very valid, because that doesn't actually prove your ability to drive. It proves your ability to like read a question and answer a multiple choice prompt. Predictive validity then is like the ACT or the SAT. And this says, does the test predict what it's designed to do? So like your intelligence or your future success in college. And so, like I said, the ACT and the SAT fall into that category. So yeah, reliability is, do you score the same test to test? Validity is it testing what it's supposed to be testing? So just make sure you clarified between those two factors.